And welcome to PM Express tonight. It's a big conversation we are having, and I'm going to be introducing my guest pretty shortly. Plus, the topic is one that all of you are feeling the pinch as far as this particular matter is concerned. It is about the internet blackout. We're going to be trying to delve a bit deeper into it and understand what really is happening. PM Express is always brought to you by Syntax Tanks. It is strong, it is tough. Alomo Bitters experience greatness in every moment. Ghana AIDS Commission, Pepsodent, every smile matters. And as you know, I recommend to you always Syntax Tanks because it is a tank for you. It has warranty that nobody else has, but also it comes bespoke. You can get all sizes you want, all colors as well. All you need to do is to pick your phone and call them. They have 7 years warranty that nobody else has that. 0244-335-168 or shop online at syntaxgh.com. Syntax Tanks are your strong, are your tough. And Pepsodent is also one that comes in highly recommended here on PM Express because it has pro-fluoride and microcalcium ingredients, sealing tiny and invisible holes in your teeth. This prevents cavities, keeps your teeth strong and mouth healthy. But it also comes in different packs, 175 pack all the way down to 12G sachet. So you can afford one or the other. We want to make sure that you have something just for your pocket. Pepsodent, every smile matters. Now, talking about the subject for today, it is one that many of you have been talking about. It's been trending over the last few days. That is, if you indeed have internet. This is a crisis, and we learned from the communications minister today that is indeed one that has left the country paralyzed in many of its very important sectors. And let's talk about it. We've had bits and pieces from the National Communications Authority about what is happening, but tonight we're bringing all the voices together so we look at where we are tonight. They've told us that we can expect this to be resolved fully in the next 3 to 5 weeks. In fact, a minimum of 5 weeks. But we've also seen incrementally that capacity is being brought on that makes it easier for you to access. But we're learning a bit more from the Communications Ministry that we are now prioritizing some essential services, which means that the bandwidth available for you is going to go to financial services and it's also going to go to public utility services because it is essential. Why is this important? For example, if you want to buy electricity credit right now from ECG and you have one of those remote devices that allows you to upload your credit onto your meter, you need connectivity to do so. If the ECG, for example, hasn't got the bandwidth, they're unable to function and you struggle to upload data and upload credit onto your meter at home. That is why public utilities are getting special treatment. But also financial services is absolutely important. If you've tried to go to the bank to withdraw money or to transact a business that is anchored on connectivity and data, you possibly realize that it's more difficult to do that in the last few days than any other time possibly in our history. This has been called unprecedented, and that's why we are now learning from the Communications Ministry, the NCA, that we are prioritizing us at this moment in terms of the bandwidth, financial services, and public utility services. What it means is that there's going to be very little left for the rest of us as the NCA begins to put in a bit more in terms of the bandwidth. But it is the MNOs, that's the mobile networks, that are doing this. And as you heard already, this is taking us a minimum of 5 weeks to try and resolve and bring back full connectivity. That many look at and say that is taking too long. What can we do right now is a big question. But this is the reason why we are off. This is one that has never happened before from all the experts, from the NCA, from the minister himself, even from the telcos, to have all your subsea cables non-responsive at the same time, cut or simply offline. It is one they haven't experienced before. The communications minister today told us they have investigated and it's highly likely it was because of a landslide underneath the ocean that may have caused this. Some geological events, significant one indeed, may have caused what we saw, cutting the ACE, the main one, the SAT3, the WACS. These are cables that bring in voice, data, and internet services into the country, and that, in essence, is what has led to the challenge that we have. But of course, Glow One is active still, and Act is 80 is a link to that, and that is why you've seen that day have money to still give you some form of service. But this is how widespread the problem is. Ghana is not the only country in this, but I wanted to look at the significance and where we are in terms of how we've been hit. If we put in the bigger scheme of things in the countries that I showed you just right now, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Benin, South Africa, you realize that Ghana is one of the countries worst hit, but not the worst hit country. The worst hit country is Ivory Coast, and according to NetBlocks that monitors internet connectivity and across the world, they are at 3% connectivity. That is very minimal. Looking at the size of the country, they rank them as severe. We are in the high category of 24%. The key question, though, we have to ask tonight, since Thursday, have we moved forward? Because this, by the way, is according to the NetBlocks on the 14th of March. But where are we tonight? Has this improved? And where are we in terms of moving closer to the 100% mark, which is really where we want to be, or some in the region of 95, 99% there. And I'm going to find out from my guests tonight. And one thing I have noticed is this is very erratic. One time it is working fine, the next time it isn't working. What's happening? Why is it unstable? And the ship that we understand is going to be dispatched now will also need permits from some of the countries where the cables run to also get into the deep seas to resolve this. So this is a very complex process. The cable ship is a very complex process to first secure it and then dispatch it to site, get the divers in, they get the cables out onto the ship, they repair, and then they send it back. The communications minister has been before Parliament today and has been briefing them about what is happening, and he's talking about the financial utility service providers should consider hosting critical services locally. But a few other things that she's told us tonight, including the alternative satellite use. And some have suggested, why is Ghana not considering the alternative satellite use in this crisis? And she said, well, that is something that can be looked at, but is going to be prohibitive in terms of costs. Right now, they're working, fine-tuning the legal regime to license other satellite service providers like Starlink, Elon Musk's Starlink, and others, so that, of course, down the line, this is not repeated. But the telcos have also now been instructed to increase their connectivity when it comes to the cable, undersea cable service providers. So that is another directive that we've had today. Key question tonight, where are we in terms of getting full connectivity? Yes, we've been told to expect this to be resolved in 5 weeks, but from 24% connectivity, have we sort of improved that over the last few days? Because we've been told that capacity has been coming on, MTN and others are getting help from our partners in the South region. My guests will join me. You need information to plan, and I'll try and get you the information here on PM Express after this. And thanks for staying with us here on PM Express. My guest joining me tonight for a conversation is Dr. Kenneth Ashigbe. He is the CEO of the Ghana Chamber of Telecommunications. He's also an engineer, so he understands a bit of what we're talking about, and he will give us a sense of where we are tonight. Sam George is a deputy ranking member on the Communications Committee in Parliament. He was in Parliament when the Communications Minister briefed the House. He has a few issues that he believes needs some attention. Maximus Ametogo is the technology analyst, and also joining us tonight is Stephen Kujo Seshi, who is the head of the National Computer Emergency Response Team at the Cyber Security Authority. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time here on PM Express. Dr. Kenashibe, let me start with you. Today, when the NCA statement came before we heard from the minister, there had been a meeting at which we were told that the conclusion was that the MNOs will give some priority when it comes to the bandwidth to the financial services, but also the public utilities because of their critical nature. Where are we in terms of implementing that new, I guess, policy in the midst of this crisis?
So thank you very much, Evans. It's important that the critical infrastructure gets data to be able to do their work. But then the interesting thing is that it would also take customers to interface with that critical infrastructure. So as the NCA asked for extra bandwidth for these critical infrastructure, it is not to also take away from what customers have. So you can see as the days go by that extra capacity is being added and connectivity is being restored gradually. So what would happen is to add on more for these critical infrastructure, which would really, it's a difficult thing to do, trying to separate all of them, but also ensuring that you also carry the customers also along, because it would come to naught if you were able to provide, say, the banks with good infrastructure for their services to be up. But then when it comes to the banking customers' ability to be able to access these infrastructure, they will be found wanting. So work would be done as we roll on more bandwidth capacity to ensure that these critical infrastructure have enough to be able to stay up and available to their customers, and also ensure that if Ghana Water was up, if ECG was up, you, the consumer who also needed to go and get some top up to ensure that you had utility services, you also were getting it.
Okay, so there's a very interesting balancing act you need to do. Critical services, you need to get the bandwidth, but also you need to also meet the customers' needs. But you have an acute shortage of bandwidth, and so you have to play within what you have. Although the policy says give the critical services a bit more focus, I also need to understand where are we tonight in terms of the connectivity percentage for the entire country. I mean, the Bloomberg and Co were reporting at 24%.
I would have to get that data for you. I'm pretty sure we should be able to get that to us tomorrow. But the interesting thing is that you find out that the best measure for all of us is the fact that as of this evening, we're able to sit and do Zoom via videos. We all have our videos. We are able to really stream video. That tells you that the level of connectivity is improving. On Thursday, you would not even have been able to do a voice, and so the detail is the devil is in the detail. It's in our ability to be able to experience it, and that is the focus of industry. The focus is that as we wait for those four cables that have been cut to be brought upstream, what do we do to be able to get capacity from other places to be able to show what we have almost to what we had before we went down, so that by the time these four cables come up, all we have to do is to swap for where we are going to take capacity from and bring these up on stream.
Maximum, there's an important point Dr. Ashigbe is making, is that the mere fact that we are having a Zoom conversation on PM Express tonight, it means that a lot has improved since Thursday. In fact, you wouldn't even notice that's a problem, because there's no way we should be having a Zoom conversation in the midst of this crisis.
Exactly, and not even a video Zoom call, right? So the end users of the telecom service, I'm sure they are the best witnesses of what is happening. So others are falling on other functioning telecom service providers like the ATs and the rest. I use MTN, so MTN is working fine. I have another ISP in my office. It's also working. It's quite stable now. So we are the best people to also tell whether something is improving or not, because whatever NCA writes on paper or whatever the government tells us, we are the best people to tell whether the service is improving or not.
And your verdict is it has improved significantly from Thursday, I guess.
Exactly. So now I can, earlier in the morning, I tried downloading a 370 megabytes video from a client, and it took me almost 2 hours. But just this evening, it took less than 5 minutes to get that downloaded. So for me, it has improved, and we could even do this Zoom in the morning.
And Stephen, at the Cybersecurity Secretariat, we haven't had your view in the midst of this crisis. What's been your own assessment there?
Well, from the CSA, we'll look at it from this angle. So first of all, the fact that we've designated the telecom sector as a critical infrastructure sector. And what that means from the perspective of the Cybersecurity Act is that this is a service or this is infrastructure whose absence or unavailability would result in a socioeconomic impact or a national security issue. And I think we can easily relate to the fact that in the last few days, our ability to do digital transactions have been severely impacted by this. Now, we can connect that to our work as a protective entity. So we have a critical infrastructure protection division whose job it is to analyze the entities that are playing in this sector and then go on to understand what infrastructure they are using and whether that infrastructure is designed appropriately, is protected appropriately to avoid some of these scenarios. So for us, even as we are monitoring what's going on and following very closely with the sector regulator, NCA, and all the effort they're putting in, the lessons we are picking up that we would need to work with these critical infrastructure owners has to do with, okay, how can we improve the measures we have in place in terms of protection? So for example, we've heard in the conversations that yes, there is an element of swapping capacity between cables to protect them. But then let's also look at the services side. So for example, do we have digital services within the country that are potentially transiting to external areas? So you are on the cloud somewhere and don't have a fallback in case a scenario like this plays out. So that becomes an architecture issue. How are we architecting the digital systems we are building? So it means we need to improve what we are doing. We should be able to build systems. If you're using government systems or banking systems within Ghana, it should be possible for us to exchange or keep that traffic locally.
Yeah,
without relying too much
and
on
indeed,
external
that what you've just been talking about is the conversation that we are beginning to have about how do you ensure that this doesn't repeat, even if it happens, because of course, force majeure is something you can control. But when it happens, you have enough redundancies to ensure that the impact is minimal. And we'll come to that because that's the next big question we need to explore. But I want to circle back to Sam George because today the sector minister was before Parliament, giving Parliament an update on the situation. And she calls this a crisis, and it is a crisis. Of course, we've seen improvements today, and that's why we're having a conversation with guests on Zoom. Sam George, when you listen to Ursula Owusu-Ekufo, did you get the confidence that as a country, we're on top of this problem?
Not exactly. Listening to Ursula, it was clear that the regulator had failed in their job. It is clear to us that we are at the mercy of the operators. The government has absolutely no control over what will happen or what is going to happen. It comes back to what the regulators, the operators are going to do. The operators of the subsea cables, their decision, their business decision on how to restore capacity on their lines and run their business. Because I made the point on the floor of Parliament that the NCA is basically mirroring the Chamber of Telecoms. I expect my big brother Ken Ashigbe to make comments and issue statements about what the operators are seeking to do because he's the Chamber of Telecoms. He is an advocate for the operators. I expect the regulator to be telling me what policy initiatives are being introduced to protect the consumer and the rights of the consumer. None of the 4 statements from the NCA have done that. They're basically just telling you the regulators have told, we've had a meeting with the regulators, and this is what the regulators have said.
But in terms of protecting the consumer, isn't that why they say that critical services, they're given the instructions for critical services to receive priority in terms of the allocation of bandwidth? Isn't that to protect the consumer?
So if the regulator, no, you see, and that's the point. I think it was Seshi from the CSA. I don't know if it was Seshi or Maximus who made that point. No, I think it was Ken who made that point, that you could actually give critical infrastructure connectivity. But if the clients of that critical infrastructure don't have connectivity, what have you achieved? So if you give a bank priority and give them connectivity on their systems or a payments aggregator, you give him access, and the consumer who is supposed to use that service doesn't have access to the service because they don't have connectivity, you've achieved nothing. And you see, the point we must be looking at here, why I say it's a failure of the regulator, is that we shouldn't now be having a conversation of local caches or data exchanges in Ghana. This is something other regulators have worked on as proactive regulators. The NCA has slept on this job. And now we are being told that the things that other regulators have by way of policy implemented in their home countries, making sure that service providers like Facebook, like Twitter, like Netflix, like Amazon have local caches, which first and foremost will even make it cheaper for data for customers when you're using your data to stream, because it's streaming locally vis-a-vis the traffic and the bandwidth that's needed. We've sat down and now we are using this crisis to talk about these things as though they are new policy initiatives that we didn't know we should have implemented. Take it from me. In 5 weeks' time, after the operators have solved their problem, the regulator will go back to sleep.
I mean, Maximo, do you agree with that view?
I don't agree with that view, because you see, you are talking regulators and then a sector, right? So the regulator will not come and do the services, but agree that we need policies in that direction. I'm sure we still have that, because some companies do local hosting of their content and all that. For me, I will indulge Honorable George to keep pushing so that we get some of these platforms to also host locally. And I'm sure he's been championing some of the stuff in the tech space. And that's one thing that we should think about, caching content, so that if I want to consume that particular content, I don't need to go through a pipeline outside of Ghana to consume the same content
But the question is asking is, why are we now saying we will do this in the midst of a crisis? That this is something we should have done in anticipation of something like this?
You know, most of these things are platform, initiatives. So Netflix will say, okay, I guess this much traffic from Ghana or this much traffic from Nigeria. So why don't I cache the content in Ghana so that they consume it locally? Then they will talk to a data center and say, can you host my content in Ghana? I have been in the esports space, and that's one thing we've been talking to even some of the hosting companies, that can you host some of the video games on your platform? So anybody in Ghana who wants to buy a video game, they can download it locally. They don't need to, download it external, of Ghana. For me, it's a private initiative. NCA will not go and build a data center to cache every content that we consume in Ghana on those platforms. Google has their own platform in Ghana. So you realize their services came back on quickly, and some other platforms have the same thing. So for me, these are private initiatives that the regulator will push, and I'm sure there's a policy for that. And these are things that even banks, if a bank service goes down, they suffer more, right? And their customers will also suffer along. But you can't blame the regulator that the banks didn't prepare for that. Right.
But
so
that,
the policy.
But that is a fact.
If I could jump in, Maximus,
yes.
I think that you're making the same point I'm making, but failing to place the responsibility somewhere. There's a reason why you have a regulator. The regulator is to enforce standards. So if you agree with me that the best standard in the industry is to have local caches, ask yourself why Google has a local cache here. Ask yourself why Meta has a local cache here. It's simply because there was a political will and a political decision by somebody preceding this minister to engage those companies and say, this is what we want in our country, put it in here. So it is the failure of those sitting there today to engage the likes of Twitter and enforce the minimum, what we'll call best operating practices or standard operating practices in other jurisdictions. Because if you don't have the regulator is, I'm not asking the regulator to build the cache, but the regulator George, can then put in the policy.
Oh no, but what you are saying is a case study that NCA knows about. But I'm not sure NCA went to Google and said, Google, come and cache here, or Facebook, come and cache your content here. I'm not sure they went there to push. Google has huge traffic coming to Ghana. Facebook is #1 platform, in Ghana in terms of web traffic. And Google, they make a lot of money in Ghana. So it makes sense for them to come and catch here. But if you are going to talk to some smaller...
Maximus, I can share with you that Google coming into Ghana was on the back of the provision of the national tier 3 data center to them, and provisioning and telling them that, look, there is capacity here. It was pitched to them, I can tell you this on authority, at the Mobile World Conference in Barcelona in 2014. So that's what I'm saying to you, that
it's not the benefit. That's why they are doing it. So
it took someone reaching out to them.
One person at a time.
Someone reaching out to them to say to them, we need you to come in. We have the infrastructure for it. The national data center is still sitting there. It's got infrastructure to host Amazon, to host Netflix. Who has reached out to them? Twitter had an office in Ghana. When Elon Musk took over, they decided to shut down that office. Who in the ministry or who in government decided to reach out to Twitter and say, why are you shutting down an office in Ghana? They moved into Nigeria. And that's what I'm saying. It is the environment you create by the regulator and the policymaker. It's critical to keep these people in country.
Maximus, that is obviously something that we need to look at in terms of long-term solutions. But Sam George, in terms of, in the interim, people need full connectivity. Did the minister provide a roadmap for this to happen in the interim? Because we have to wait 5 weeks to get full internet connectivity. And I heard her say, for example, that the satellite option is expensive, and they are now in the process of fine-tuning the legal regime to license, satellite, service providers like Starlink, etc., to get that to happen. But even if we can now, it's going to be very expensive to use that as an interim measure. In other words, we don't have an interim measure per se, compared to what the telecom operators are dispatching and bringing in capacity from partners in the sub-region.
Well, let me be frank and say that I agree with the minister on satellites not being a reliable backup plan, because satellites, apart from its unreliability due to weather, you cannot even carry the level of bandwidth that you're requiring to carry, for example, the traffic that MTN is carrying. I mean, MTN is piping over 170 gigabytes per second on ACE and 150 gigabytes per second on WAX. So clearly you can't do that by satellite. So I agree with the minister on that. But the reality here is this. If you cannot do that as satellite backup, how is it that Ivory Coast, the country where the landing was affected, where in the loop of the cables was affected, Ivory Coast is at almost 80% recovery, and Ghana is nowhere near that? It's simply because, again, and that's the point Harun Idrisu made in his submission on the floor of the House, you've had a sector that is deeply challenged. Glo is one of the pipelines that is still carrying capacity right now. Glo shut down in Ghana and shut shop on the 14th of January this year. So if Glo was still landing in Ghana, with all of the challenges that were existing on the Glo 1 line, you'd have had ability to pipe some capacity in now. What MTN and a few of the other companies, I think Telecel, are doing is to try and get some capacity on the Equiano line. That's the Google cable from Togo. Equiano was begging to land in Ghana for 2 years. 2 solid years. Google was begging to land their Equiano cable in Ghana. It is when we couldn't put our house in order that they went to land in Togo. The Equiano cable is not impacted. So imagine if Equiano was sitting here in Ghana and had landed because the regulator and the policymaker had done their job. And the capacity on the Equiano line is bigger than the 5 cables in Ghana that already land in Ghana put together. So if we had Equiano landing in Ghana 2 years ago when they came, and the policymaker and regulator had been up to scratch and done their job, we could have easily all switched all of our traffic onto Equiano right now, and we wouldn't have had this downtime. So if you talk about credible, reliable solutions, it's to get another landing from, if possible, to get Equiano back into Ghana. There is the 2Africa line that has been landed in Accra, but I think will come on stream. The minister talks about it coming on stream in the fourth quarter. That also carries huge capacity. We need to attract at least 2 or 3 more high capacity lines landing in Ghana, and then that gives you some level of redundancy that you can deal with. Because right now what we are doing is picking capacity from Nigeria, but the capacity coming from Nigeria is very limited. A large chunk of the capacity that's being used today, that is carrying, I'm sure most of us on this network are using MTN. I'm using MTN. What I'm using is MTN cable capacity that has been piped from Togo, Equiano. Telecel is also trying to get some capacity from Togo, and it is AT that is getting some capacity from Nigeria. But AT's market share is very minimal. I mean, it's very small. I don't say it's negligible, but it's very small. But when you talk about Telecel and MTN, whatever capacity we have now is from the same Equiano line that we failed to facilitate to land in Accra, that we are getting excess capacity now from Togo. So that's why I say the regulator and the policymaker have failed. Yeah, because we could have prepared for this 2 years ago. Yeah, I mean, we hadn't made frustrated Equiano out of the Ghanaian market.
Let me get Ken Ashigbe's thoughts on the subject of what to do in the interim. Of course, we've seen that there's been improvement, but Dr. Ken Ashigbe, on the comment by Sam George about the London cables here and additional ones, and where MTN is getting it from and how you can improve that going forward. What's your comment on that? Because, of course, you represent the telcos. Some of them are doing great. Some of them, like AT, wasn't as affected. The question is why? Why is it that they weren't affected, but others were? And what was the issue there?
So you see, Sam George makes the point of the fact that AT was their primary source of where they were picking from did not suffer that much. So they still kept a bit of their primary source intact. They lost on Main 1 and co. And then also of the fact that, so you saw that MTN was on wax primarily, Telecel was on SAT3 primarily. Those went down, and the backups also went down as well. But you see, so as we start trying to move capacity from Togo, there's a terrestrial fiber that we've been able to bring in, and we continue to engage. There's conversation as far as Angola to be able to bring some capacity in. So a lot of work will still go on in trying to ramp up the amount of capacity that we are able to bring in. And so that in that process, if you are able, and you see some of the challenges you're also beginning to face, is that as you try to bring capacity from the east, you then go and encounter those 3 cables that were damaged in the Red Sea as well. And so that makes it a lot more difficult for you. But in the coming days, as we wait for the 4 cables to be fixed, we will try to lift a lot more capacity to come so that we would be able to ramp up as high as we ought to do. Equiano, basically, because it was an act of God, they were spared. And it's true, if you had Equiano in, based on the act of God, we would have benefited from it. And I think that from a policy point of view, we should be pushing for a lot more of these cables coming into town. Because it's interesting that if you take the distances apart of all those 4 cables, a total of 160 kilometers, but all of the 4 have been impacted. So it has just told us that, we are not as resilient with fiber as we thought. So the numbers, it's going to be a numbers game. Apart from being a numbers game, we need going forward to be working on our pulling and our ability to be able to pull. And not only do we pull locally, but we need to also start working on our ability to be able to pull as a sub-region. And then as we're looking at pulling, not only is the subsea, not only should we be looking at subsea, also all our electric pylons and all of that we have. If you take Gridco, for example, they have fiber. We've had fiber from the VRA days all the way up to now. We have fiber on that. So if we could also ensure that there's interconnection between our various countries so that we are able to pull, we are able to have that interconnection done, then terrestrial fiber could also be one of the things that you bring in when all of these things happen. And then the conversation you're having about the local exchanges, the conversations you're having about ensuring, and it's not only going to be the NTA, coming up with a policy direction. You would have the likes of the Bank of Ghana, you would have the likes of other regulators also making it a point that, we should we should ensure that we are able to fall back on the locally. I remember when Bank of Ghana was telling these the cards, that they needed to do their local transactions locally. Initially there was a lot of pushback on it. But incidents like this let you see that it is really important for us to be, self-sufficient to some extent. So far as, these networks are concerned, NITA has a tier 4 data center now. The other MNOs also have their data centers coming up. So it is important that we encourage ourselves to use the various exchanges we have, empower them, facilitate them, ensure that we put some resources behind them, and ensure that, we are doing a lot more of our local content in-house. So all of these are factors that would ensure some self-sufficiency. I remember a few years, Russia, tried that, where they cut off all internet to see what the impact is going to be. Well, we have not done that, but fortunately, this crisis, and that's the benefit of a crisis, this has exposed that. And so what we need to do, working together with all the regulators, the NCA, the Bank of Ghana, all other regulators, the health regulators, all of us, with the policymakers, let's ensure that coming out of this, we should be able to have a scenario that if we were off, at least we're going to be able to survive with the very necessities on our local traffic, and also expand that to the sub-region as well, in such a way that if it happened, sub-regional networks were going to be able to work, and then expand that into Africa. And it is really important that we build that capacity for ourselves.
And that is a critical point I will return to with the cybersecurity authorities rep who's with us, because assuming this was not an act of God, at least now it's almost certain that has been ruled out now that this is a geological event. A landslide is what the minister says most likely caused this. This actually could also been targeting of Ghana and other countries in the sub for whatever reason, right? So our redundancies must be strengthened. We just said, can actually make the point. Well, what is cybersecurity? How is they taking it? And how they also have legislation that empowers them to do a bit more in this area. We'll get his thoughts on this. But I'm also interested in the cable ship that needs to get quickly there to the sites where the cables have been damaged to begin the repairs. I mean, Ken Ashibe was the first mentioned it to me last week. I want to hear where we are in getting the cable, to dispatching that cable ship to the sites to start work, because it is when you dispatch that you begin to count to the fifth week, right? I want to get some clarity on that also when we return from this break. Stay with me. My guest with me tonight here on PM Express, Dr. Kenneth Ashigbe, is the CEO of the Ghana Chamber of Telecommunications. Also with me is Sam George. He is the Deputy Ranking Member on the Communications Committee of Parliament. Maximus Ametogo is a technology analyst. And Stephen Kojo Seshi is the head of the National Computer Emergency Response Team at the Cybersecurity Authority. And Stephen, it's to you I come next, because this is also a major national security incident. We've heard a lot about what we need to do. I mean, we feel the debate in terms of putting in place enough redundancy. But Ken Ashibe has talked about what we need to do going forward. So has Sam George. From the cybersecurity point of view, what must change now? And how are you approaching this? Hello, Stephen. I can't hear you. You can mute for me. Okay. We may have lost power at his end. We'll try and get that connected. After all, this is still a moment of a bit of a crisis with internet connectivity, so you can't excuse us. And of course, Stephen, because of the challenges having. And I want to bring in Maximus Maximus on, well, we will try and fix that. I understand that our internet is down. Of course, this is illustrating the conversation we are having tonight on the internet blackout, understanding the crisis. The internet just went off. I've just been talking about this here on PM. We started by talking about the fact that this is obviously the best indication yet that there has been improvement. There has been improvement, but we are not out of the woods, not by a long shot. It's the reason why the communications minister today has been speaking in Parliament and has been talking about the roadmap towards restoring full connectivity, and which, by the way, she says is going to take at least 5 weeks. We've heard that from the NCA. The minister is confirming that. An important element of that is the dispatch of this cable ship, and that cable ship has to be licensed to move into the territorial waters of other countries in the sub-region. That in itself is a challenge that needs to be resolved. If they move, or when they move, because they certainly will have to move, then the counting will start. So there are a lot of moving parts tonight in terms of resolving this issue with the internet connectivity. And there's a reason why my Zoom conversation tonight has truncated, and we are trying to fix that and hopefully move on to another service provider so we can wrap up this conversation, because it's very important to hear from the cybersecurity point of view what they are contributing to the resolution of this, but also down the line dealing with the redundancies, because this could well have been a cybersecurity issue, a cyber attack, right? I mean, cutting a country's connectivity to the internet is an act of war. Many will look at it like that, if indeed it's proving that it's not an act of God, but we're targeted. And that's why we need to have that last bit there and also get a clarity on whether the cable ship had moved. The minister talked about that. But also today, we also got a directive from the communications minister now to the telcos, who will have to increase the number of subsea cable service providers that they work with, right? As we've been indicating on the screen, we have at least four of them that they've been working with. If you add Glow, it will be 5, but 4 of them for the 2 main major service providers. They were using 4. I mean, the minister says the directive has now been issued for the telcos to now connect a bit more. And that's why we've been talking today about landing some of the cables in Ghana, additional cables coming into the country. And wherever you are tonight, you may be experiencing the same challenge we are experiencing here on the show tonight. But of course, it's a crisis, and this illustrates that perfectly. I'm going to take a quick break. Return with my guest, hopefully. Other than that, we're going to be telling you where we are with solving this and what the minister was also saying in Parliament specifically.
The initial remote investigations by all affected cable providers have given them the approximate locations where the cables have been damaged. To commence the repairs, these cable providers need permits from the authorities in Côte d'Ivoire and or Senegal. The vessels will then be assigned to retrieve the necessary spares required for the repair work before sailing to the 4th location to conduct the physical repair work. The affected section of the submarine cable will have to be pulled up from the seabed onto the ship where the repair vessel, where it will be spliced by skilled technicians to complete the repair. It will then be tested for any defects and which will be fixed and then lowered back to the seabed. This process, I'm told, might take between 1 and 2 weeks for the actual repairs, while it will take about 2 to 3 weeks of transit time for the vessel to pick up the spares and then travel from Europe to West Africa once the vessel is mobilized. And that is what the NCA indicated it will take a minimum period of about 5 weeks for full services to be restored. With regard to the use of satellites as an alternative, it is important to note that the bandwidth of the satellite backup for network operators cannot replace the capacity that has been lost due to the outage. Satellite backup for consumers immediate initiatives that the government will undertake is that we will license satellite gateway earth stations, London rights, and satellite earth station networks.
So that's the minister there talking about the next steps, licensing satellite networks to come in and help with this particular challenge going forward, including Starlink, Elon Musk's Starlink. And that's where we are tonight with the update from the minister in Parliament. You also heard her talk about that cable ship. Unfortunately, the connectivity here is not going to be allowing us to get the very latest on that cable ship. It appears there's a lot resting on the dispatching of that cable ship, getting to the exact location where they've now identified where the cables that have been cut are under the seabed, and then beginning the repair works. That, for me, is a cardinal point in beginning to resolve this crisis in the long term in the way that restores internet capabilities fully. Unfortunately, because of the connectivity challenges, as you can imagine, we're able to get that update for you. But of course, this is a conversation that is ongoing. We'll get that for you in our subsequent shows. PM Express is always brought to you by Syntax Tanks. It's also brought to you by Ghana AIDS Commission, Pepsodent, and Alomo Bitters. Enjoy the rest of your evening.